They thought she was just another quiet girl, until the first punch shattered their arrogance. In a small-town high school, whispers of cruelty filled the hallways. A new girl walked in. Her skin marked her different. Her silence made her a target. The bullies laughed, mocked, and circled, thinking they'd found their prey. But behind her calm eyes was a storm, and when it finally broke loose, no one in that school would ever forget the day. She sat alone at lunch, her tray untouched, the steam from the cafeteria food rising in front of her like faint ghosts that quickly vanished into the noise around her. The room was alive with chatter, laughter, and the clatter of trays and chairs. But around her there was only silence, an empty bubble of isolation that made her presence stand out even more. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the small patterns of scratches across the plastic table, as if staring long enough at them would let her disappear into the surface. Her hands trembled faintly, not from hunger, but from the weight of being watched. She knew their eyes were on her, sharp, mocking, filled with the same cruel curiosity that had followed her since the moment she first stepped into this school. The first laugh cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. She didn't need to look up to know where it came from. The bullies circled her in silence at first, like predators who enjoyed the hunt far more than the strike. One leaned too close to her shoulder, pretending to sniff the air, before wrinkling his nose dramatically. "Smells different," he muttered, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. Laughter erupted. Another reached for her tightly coiled hair, tugging at one strand with mock fascination. "What even is this?" Like a mop, more laughter. Their words layered on top of one another, each insult sharper than the last, digging into her like invisible knives. Her accent was next. She had spoken just once that day, a soft "excuse me" when someone blocked her way in the hallway, and already it had become ammunition. They imitated her voice, stretching out vowels, adding exaggerated tones, spitting her words back at her with cruel distortion. Every sound that came out of their mouths wasn't just noise, it was an attempt to strip her down, to remind her she didn't belong. The cafeteria seemed to shrink around her, the voices growing louder, bouncing off the walls, mixing with the sound of clattering trays until it all became one heavy roar pressing against her ears. But she didn't move. She didn't look up. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing tears. Inside, her chest burned with the heat of humiliation, every cruel word sparking a fire that threatened to climb into her throat, but she swallowed it, forcing it deeper. Her silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It was a shield, one she had carried with her long before stepping into this school. Each insult hurt, yes, but she had learned to take pain and fold it into herself, to lock it away behind a wall of composure that no one could break. The bullies didn't see strength in that silence. They saw weakness. To them, her stillness was an invitation, a chance to push harder, to test how far they could go before she cracked. One of them reached across her tray, grabbed a piece of bread, and tore it in half, crumbs scattering across the table. Another leaned in so close she could feel his breath on her cheek, whispering things that made the others burst out laughing again. Their voices blurred into one, taunts mixing with jeers, but she stayed still. She sat with her hands resting tightly on her lap, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of her skirt, her heart pounding so loudly she thought they might hear it. In that moment, she remembered all the times before, different faces, different places, but the same cruelty. Moving meant starting over, and starting over meant being the outsider once again. Her accent, her skin, her quiet nature, it had always been enough to make her stand out, and standing out had always made her a target, but each time, she had survived. Not by fighting back with words, not by breaking down, but by holding everything in, waiting, watching. She had learned that silence could be power, that patience could be sharper than any insult. The bullies didn't know this. They didn't know the fire she carried in her veins, the training her body had endured, the strength buried beneath her calm exterior. They only saw a quiet girl sitting alone, trembling slightly, eyes lowered. They thought she was fragile glass, ready to shatter. What they didn't realize was that behind that lowered gaze, she was measuring them, studying their movements, memorizing every cruel laugh, every shove, every mocking word. She wasn't weak. She was waiting. And though they didn't see it, the silence around her was shifting. What seemed like fear was turning into something else, something dangerous, something that would one day rise and change the way everyone in that cafeteria remembered her forever. One afternoon, a shove went too far, her books scattered, laughter echoed, and something inside her broke. She raised her head for the first time, and the fire in her eyes froze the hallway. With precision and power, she defended herself every strike, every movement born from years of hidden training, and expanded into a 5,000+ word continuous cinematic story without headings. That means I'll create a long, flowing, novel-style narration filled with emotion, suspense, and description, like a film on paper. Because 5,000+ words is very large for one go, I'll start writing part 2 in long, continuous narration. Once it gets long, I'll continue in multiple turns until the full 5,000+ words are complete. Here's the beginning expansion. One afternoon, a shove went too far. It was not the usual bump in the hallway, not the casual brush of shoulders meant to remind her that she was unwanted. This time it was deliberate, full-bodied, a violent force that sent her stumbling forward. Her books slipped from her hands, scattering across the polished floor, pages bending and tearing under the careless stomp of passing shoes. The echo of laughter followed immediately, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the lockers and walls until it filled every corner of the hallway. For a heartbeat, she stayed on the ground, palms pressed flat against the cold tile, her breath stuck in her chest. Her body shook, not from fear, but from something deeper, something long restrained. The bullies laughed louder, circling around her fallen books like hyenas picking at scraps. One of them kicked a notebook further down the hallway. Another picked up her pencil only to snap it in half and toss the pieces over her head. Their shadows fell across her like a cage, and yet in that suffocating moment, something inside her shifted. The weight of every insult, every mocking laugh, every cruel touch burned through her chest until it felt unbearable. Her silence, once a shield, was cracking. Her patience, once her greatest strength, was being tested beyond its limits. She lowered her head as if to collect her books, but her heart was pounding so violently that she could no longer hear their voices. The noise faded into a dull roar, and all that remained was the heat rising inside her. Then she lifted her head. For the first time since she had entered that school, her eyes locked with theirs. The fire in her gaze was sharp, unrelenting, a storm that froze the laughter. The bullies who had leaned close with mocking grins faltered, stepping back instinctively, as if some primal instinct warned them they had awakened something dangerous. The hallway, which just moments ago had been alive with noise, fell silent under the weight of her stare. She rose slowly, deliberately, gathering herself not with the timid movements they expected, but with the controlled grace of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Her shoulders straightened, her fists loosened at her sides, her breath steadied. Years of hidden training, hours of repetition in dimly lit rooms. The rhythm of strikes against pads, the sweat and bruises she had carried in silence, all of it surfaced in that moment. The first bully reached out, perhaps to shove her again, perhaps to prove he wasn't afraid. But before his hand even touched her shoulder, she moved. Her arm shot up with precision, knocking his wrist aside, and with a swift step forward, she drove her palm into his chest. The impact echoed, a hollow thud that forced the air from his lungs, sending him stumbling backward into the lockers. Gasps filled the hallway. The others froze, their smirks wiped clean, their eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't stop. The second bully lunged forward with a curse, his fist clumsy and untrained. She ducked smoothly, her body lowering just enough for his swing to cut through empty air, and with a swift turn of her heel, she struck his knee. He collapsed with a cry, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. The crowd that had gathered at the edges of the hallway, students who had once stayed quiet or joined in the laughter, now stood in stunned silence. No one had expected this. Every movement was fluid, sharp, and controlled. She didn't fight with rage, didn't flail wildly. Each strike carried intention, born from discipline, not chaos. A kick landed against the third bully's ribs, sending him crashing into a locker door so hard it rattled. Another tried to grab her from behind, but she twisted free, her elbow driving into his side before spinning to face him again. The hallway had transformed into something unrecognizable. No longer was she the quiet girl cornered by predators. She was the storm at the center, every movement a flash of lightning, every strike a crash of thunder. The bullies, once fearless in their cruelty, now scrambled like animals caught in their own trap. Her face showed no joy, no satisfaction, only a cold determination. She wasn't fighting to prove herself, or to show off. She was fighting because they had crossed the line, because her silence had been mistaken for weakness one too many times, and now they were seeing the truth. By the time she paused, breath steady but sharp, the bullies lay scattered across the hallway floor, groaning, clutching their sides, their arrogance shattered. The students who had watched in awe stepped back, clearing a path as she bent down, quietly collecting her scattered books. She didn't say a word, didn't look at the defeated figures on the ground. She simply stacked her belongings, straightened her back, and walked forward. The silence that followed her was deafening. The hallway, once alive with laughter at her expense, was now frozen in awe and fear. They had seen the fire in her eyes, felt the weight of her strength, and understood that she was not the prey they had imagined. She was something else entirely, something unbreakable. The boy she had shoved into the lockers wheezed, clutching his chest as he slid down the metal surface. His smirk dissolved into disbelief. The sound of his breath scraping in and out filled the silence, and for a fleeting second, no one dared move. The crowd that had gathered in the hallway stared, eyes wide, mouths half open, frozen between shock and fear. It was as if time had bent, as if the world was holding its breath just to see what she would do next. The second bully, the one still clutching his leg where she had struck him, let out a broken groan. He tried to rise, using the lockers for support, but his knees buckled, sending him back down. His friends exchanged glances, panic flickering across faces that only moments ago had been painted with arrogance. Their laughter had dried up like water in the sun, leaving behind the raw scent of fear. Yet pride, stupid, blinding pride, made one of them step forward anyway. He raised his fists clumsily, his jaw clenched, forcing himself to prove that he still held power. But she saw through him. She saw his shaking hands, the way his stance faltered, the doubt clouding his eyes. He swung. It was wide, desperate, uncalculated. She leaned back just enough, the fist slicing the air in front of her nose. The motion was almost graceful, like a dancer moving with perfect timing. Then her elbow shot forward with precision, slamming into his shoulder, twisting him off balance. Before he could recover, she shifted her weight, swept his feet out from under him, and sent him crashing onto the cold tiles. Gasps erupted around them. The sound wasn't laughter anymore, it was awe, disbelief, a ripple of energy that spread like fire through the crowd. Phones had begun to rise, hands trembling as students recorded the scene, desperate to capture what felt like an unfolding legend. Her chest rose and fell steadily, not ragged with rage, but calm, controlled. Inside, though, a storm roared. Each strike she delivered wasn't just against the bullies in front of her. It was against every sneer she had endured, every whispered insult, every night she had spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why being different had to mean being a target. Years of pressure, years of swallowing pain, had condensed into this moment, and now it was pouring out, not through screams or tears, but through the language her body knew best: movement, precision, power. Another rushed her, this one bolder, or perhaps too foolish to recognize the danger. He lunged, his arms reaching to grab her shoulders, to slam her against the lockers, but she pivoted sharply, her foot sliding across the tiles in perfect balance. She caught his wrist midair, twisted it downward with such force he cried out, and drove her knee upward into his stomach. The breath shot out of him like a deflated balloon, his body folding before he crumpled to the ground. The hallway erupted not with cheers, not with applause, but with the low, stunned murmurs of witnesses who knew they would remember this for the rest of their lives. Every eye was on her, every heart thundering with the realization that the quiet girl they had ignored, mocked, or pitied was something far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. She stood there, her books still scattered across the floor, surrounded by bodies groaning in pain. The scent of sweat and fear thickened the air. Her eyes scanned the bullies, unflinching, her silence more powerful than any words could have been. They avoided her gaze now, shrinking into themselves, clutching their injuries, their dominance shattered. Inside her head, though, memories stirred like ghosts. The smell of her old training gym filled her senses, the musty mats, the sound of her instructor's voice repeating the same commands until they were etched into her bones. She remembered the weight of gloves on her hands, the sting of rope burns on her palms, the echo of her own breath as she pushed through exhaustion. She had never trained for glory, never trained for spectacle. She had trained to endure, to survive. And in this hallway, all of that survival had crystallized into action. Her knuckles tingled faintly, not from injury, but from the force of her strikes. She flexed her fingers, grounding herself, reminding herself not to lose control. She could feel the eyes on her, hundreds of them, piercing, recording, judging. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand why it had taken violence for them to finally see her, but she held it in. Silence, as always, was her answer. She bent down slowly, gathering her books one by one. The pages were creased, some torn, her notes smudged with dirt and shoe prints. She brushed them off carefully, her movements deliberate, refusing to rush even though the hallway was still humming with tension. Each book stacked neatly in her arms felt heavier now, not just with paper and ink, but with the weight of everything that had just happened. No one dared approach her. Even the teachers who had been drawn by the commotion lingered at the edges, unsure how to intervene. The authority they normally wielded seemed fragile here, shattered by the unshakable aura surrounding her. When she finally straightened, books clutched tightly to her chest, she did not look at the bullies writhing on the floor. She did not acknowledge the phones pointed at her, nor the wide-eyed faces of those who would whisper her name for weeks to come. She simply began to walk. She walked through that silence like a blade cutting through water, her back straight, her gaze forward, her heart still pounding but her resolve unshaken. Behind her, the echoes of laughter were gone. All that remained was the memory of fire in her eyes, and the knowledge that the girl they had thought was weak, fragile, and alone was stronger than any of them could have imagined. When the dust settled, the hallway no longer felt like the same place. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the walls had absorbed the violence and were holding onto it, refusing to let it vanish. The bullies, once so loud and untouchable, lay sprawled across the floor. Their groans filled the silence like a broken chorus, but no one rushed to help them. Not even their friends. Not even the bystanders who had once cheered them on. They were no longer predators. They were prey who had been reminded of the price of arrogance. The crowd stood frozen. Dozens of students lined the walls, pressed shoulder to shoulder, each one afraid to move too quickly, as if even the sound of a breath might shatter the fragile quiet. Phones were still raised, cameras still glowing, but no one laughed, no one jeered. Every pair of eyes was locked on her. The girl they had mocked, ignored, underestimated, had revealed something inside herself that none of them could have imagined. And yet, She didn't bask in it. She didn't smile. She didn't let her gaze linger on the fallen boys who only minutes before had towered over her with their cruel laughter. She bent down, quiet and calm, her fingers reaching for the scattered pages of her notebooks. Her movements were deliberate, almost delicate, as if she were afraid of breaking the silence herself. One by one, she gathered her books, brushing off the dirt and footprints as if they were nothing more than dust. The hallway, a place that had always been suffocating with ridicule and judgment, now watched her in reverence, in fear, in awe. When she finally rose, the books held tightly to her chest. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look at them. She walked forward, her steps steady, each one echoing softly against the tile, cutting through the stunned stillness like the beat of a drum. No one moved to block her path. No one dared to say a word. The sea of students parted, creating a narrow passage, and she moved through it without hesitation. It was as if the crowd knew, instinctively, that they were standing in the presence of something greater than themselves. That day, she was no longer just the new girl. She was no longer the quiet stranger with trembling hands and lowered eyes. She had become something else entirely. She had become a symbol, an unspoken reminder that those who seem weakest often carry storms within them, storms that can break chains, silence, laughter, and shake entire walls. But as she walked, her heart told a different story. Inside, the storm had not passed. Her chest still burned with adrenaline, her hands tingled from the force of her strikes, and her mind raced with memories that no one around her could see. They saw strength, but they could not see the years of struggle that had carved it into her. They could not see the nights she had spent staring at the ceiling, tears burning her eyes, wondering if she would ever belong. They could not see her father's voice echoing in her ears, teaching her to stand tall, to defend herself, to never let anyone strip her dignity away. The hallway stretched before her like a long tunnel, each step pulling her further away from the chaos, further away from the broken bodies and stunned faces. But even as she reached the end, she knew the weight of what had happened would not stay behind. It would follow her. The story would spread, whispered first in cautious tones, then shouted across the cafeteria, the classrooms, the entire town. Her silence had been broken not by words, but by action, and there was no going back. By the time she pushed open the heavy doors that led outside, the afternoon sunlight fell across her face like a baptism. The warmth felt strange after the cold tension of the hallway. She blinked against the brightness, clutching her books tighter, trying to ground herself. The air smelled different here, fresh, open, untainted by fear. And yet, her mind buzzed, alive with the weight of what she had done. She had defended herself. Yes, she had shown them her strength. But what did it mean now? What would happen tomorrow, or the day after, when whispers turned into headlines, when fear turned into resentment, when admiration turned into challenge? She sat down on the concrete steps, her body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion she had denied moments earlier. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was fading, leaving behind trembling muscles and a pounding heartbeat. Her fingers brushed over the bent corners of her books, her eyes lingering on the scrawled notes smudged with dirt. She thought of how ordinary this day was supposed to have been. Lunch, classes, homework, nothing extraordinary. But fate had other plans, and now nothing would ever be ordinary again. Inside the school, the bullies were being lifted from the floor, helped up by shaky hands, their pride bleeding faster than their bodies. The crowd had already begun to disperse, some rushing to post the videos, others whispering about what they had seen. Fear had replaced laughter. Respect had replaced mockery. But among it all was something else: envy. The kind that grows like a shadow, unseen at first, but inevitable, and she knew it. She felt it deep in her bones, the knowledge that this was not the end, but the beginning of something far more complicated. To them, she had become a symbol. But symbols are not left in peace. Symbols are challenged, tested, pulled apart until their truth is revealed. Still, as she sat beneath the sunlight, her breathing steadying, she did not regret it. Not one strike, not one movement. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as weak, not as fragile, but as someone who could not be broken. She closed her eyes, let the warmth wash over her, and allowed herself a moment of quiet. Because tomorrow, she knew, the world would not be quiet anymore. Tomorrow, the whispers would begin. Tomorrow, the weight of being a symbol would settle onto her shoulders. And tomorrow, she would walk back into that school, not as the girl they thought they could break, but as the girl who had shown them all what it meant to rise. When the dust settled, the bullies lay stunned, their groans weak against the vast silence that had swallowed the hallway. The crowd that had once cheered their cruelty now stood as statues, eyes wide, hearts thundering, unable to process what they had just seen. She did not gloat. She did not laugh. She did not even look back at them. Calmly she knelt down, fingers brushing the dirt from her notebooks, gathering her things with the same quiet dignity that had always marked her. The silence was heavy, and yet it carried no shame, only awe. She rose to her feet, the weight of her books against her chest, and began to walk forward. The students parted before her, giving her space, not out of kindness, but out of reverence and fear. No one dared to whisper now. No one dared to meet her eyes. They had all seen the fire, and it had seared itself into their memory. Step by step, she left the scene behind her. The bruised bullies remained on the floor, their power stripped, their arrogance shattered. The crowd melted away, murmurs already beginning, but no one would ever speak of her as weak again. In one moment, with quiet fury and controlled strength, she had rewritten her place in their world. As the doors opened and sunlight spilled across her face, she breathed deeply, her heartbeat finally slowing. She had not wanted this fight, but she had endured it. She had not sought attention, but now she had it. And though tomorrow would bring whispers, challenges, maybe even fear, she no longer walked as just a new girl. She walked as a symbol. A reminder etched into the hearts of everyone who had seen it, that those who look the weakest often carry storms within them, that silence does not always mean surrender, and that sometimes the quietest soul hides the fiercest fight of all. And with her head held high, she stepped into the light, leaving behind the broken echoes of a past that could no longer touch her. The story was no longer theirs, it was hers, and it was only just beginning.